Okay, well, good morning. And on behalf of the entire NIST Center of Excellence for Risk-Based Community Resilience Planning, welcome to the Supporting Community Resilience webinar. My name is John Vandelent. I'm a professor at Colorado State University. I serve as co-director along with my colleague Bruce Ellingwood, also a professor here at Colorado State University. The NIST Center of Excellence has been in operation for slightly more than 1 year, so we look forward to sharing our progress and some challenges in support of community resilience over the next several hours. The Center of Excellence is funded by NIST and collaborates with NIST researchers. Finally, I am pleased to say that we have more than 300 participants registered for today's webinar event. I would like to go over today's schedule. First, we'll hear about NIST's many activities related to community resilience and how they relate to other initiatives around the nation from NIST's Dr. Terri McAllister. I'll then provide a brief overview of the Center of Excellence, including scope and objectives, differences between the Center's computational environment NIST core and existing platforms, and then short and long-term goals. Then we've divided the presentation into 3 sections. Section 1 will highlight the model components, including an introduction to the testbeds, introduce the approaches being used for modeling of physical systems, social science, and economics, all followed by a demonstration using our virtual community, Centerville. Following presentation sections 1 and 2, we'll be able to answer a few questions before moving on, but we'll address most questions at the end during the Q&A session. Please email your questions or use the chat feature on the webinar screen, and they'll be read aloud prior to answering. We'll try and get to as many of those as possible. And also please indicate if you would like to be identified, but the default will be to not identify the person asking the question by name. In the second section, we'll have 2 presentations, one focusing on damage state computation and hazards, and the other on treatment of dependencies and interdependencies. And then in the final section, our lead developer from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, Dr. Jung-Sun Lee, will provide a demonstration of the NIST Community Resilience Modeling Environment, known as NIST Core. Then Bruce Ellingwood will provide a brief recap, but more importantly discuss the Center of Excellence's next steps with a focus on year 2. Please note, for those of you unable to attend the entire webinar today, it will be posted in its entirety on YouTube immediately following today's presentations, and we'll also have a link to the webinar on the Center of Excellence webpage. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Terri McAllister, NIST Community Resilience Program Manager. Terri?
Thank you, John. So I'd like to give a brief overview of the work being conducted at NIST and context within other activities that are taking place and how our work relates to the Center of Excellence. So the NIST activities can be broken up into 2 basic areas. One is science-based tools and metrics, and under that we have recently developed community resilience guides. We are also conducting research to advance the science basis for community resilience tools and metrics, and of course collaborating closely with the Center of Excellence, who is also making this journey with us. We also have an extensive engagement and outreach activity where we have recently established a community resilience panel and are promoting the use of our community resilience guides. I'll also talk about some other resilience activities taking place at a fairly high level, but to give some context about how this work fits in with other resilience activities. So as an overall concept for community resilience, this is the guiding concept behind the work you'll be hearing today. Resilience is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. And the graphic here is showing that on the left are the community functions that we don't even think about. We just assume will be there when we need them and want them before and after disruptive events that cause damage to our communities. But the ability to deliver those functions depends very strongly on our built environment. And without that built environment being there to support the social systems that we rely upon, we see great damage to our communities and very slow recovery from these damaging events. And it's this concept of providing a strong built environment to support social systems that our work is focused on. One of the first products that NIST released last October was the Community Resilience Planning Guide. This was based on a series of workshops across the country, listening to stakeholders, talking to communities, understanding what it is that they want and need for community resilience. It's 2 volumes. The first one outlines a 6-step methodology, which I'll briefly explain in the next slide, and gives an example to help communities understand how this process might work for them. And the volume 2 is a reference guide, which goes into detail on each of the physical infrastructure systems that's addressed in most communities, as well as the social systems within communities, and dependencies and cascading effects showing how they are linked to each other. So the 6-step process for community resilience that was developed, the steps on the right, what are called steps 4, 5, and 6, these are all 6 steps are aligned with other federal agencies in the National Preparedness Goal. But most communities start at step 4. They develop a plan, they share it with their community, and then they begin to act upon it. But what we found out is that to do a truly comprehensive and integrative community plan, you need to start with steps 1, 2, and 3. You need to bring all your stakeholders to the table, both private and public. You cannot just have your own community leaders developing these plans. You also need to understand your community. If you had an event today, how would your community respond to that event? What condition would your built environment be in? Do you have the agencies that are aiding recovery in unreinforced masonry buildings that will not be functional? These are the types of things that a community needs to evaluate and understand, as well as the changing demands that may be made on their social systems. You may have increased demand for health care, emergency response. Is your community able and ready to deliver that? And of course, then how these 2 things are supported and linked with each other. This is a very key step to making your plans for the future of your community, and forms the basis for developing your long-term goals that communities can then develop plans around. So this is the crux of the Community Resilience Planning Guide. It's been downloaded over 2,000 times since its release in October, and we've had contact with a number of communities that have either started using it or are developing plans to integrate it into their community planning. We also released in December a supporting document, the Economic Decision Guide, because often it gets down to the economics of how do we fund these activities and how do we understand their benefit. So the Economic Decision Guide provides a standard methodology for evaluating investment decisions for community resilience, and it's designed to work with the Community Resilience Planning Guide and provides a mechanism to evaluate and prioritize the resilience actions that communities are considering, and offers a way to weigh alternative solutions and understand the benefits and the cost that they may provide for a community. And another aspect of our community outreach is the Community Resilience Panel, which was established last November. We had our first meeting at NIST. We recently held a second meeting in Portland, Oregon in April, and we'll have a third meeting in the fall in the Denver area. And the mission of the Community Resilience Panel is to bring together stakeholders, all the stakeholders, public and private, design professionals, community leaders, codes and standards folks, to help reduce barriers to achieving community resilience by promoting collaboration among these stakeholders that don't usually talk to each other and work together, and focus on the built environment and how they support social systems. And we are very pleased to have federal co-sponsors that are supporting this activity that are shown there on the right. So we often get asked, there's so much going on in community resilience. How does the NIST work and the Center of Excellence work fit in with all the other activities taking place? And this is a brief list. These are some of the more prevalent activities that many people have heard of, and I just want to give some context here. So on the left are the federal agencies. You have your Department of Homeland Security with infrastructure protection. They focus strongly on critical infrastructure with regional and national impact on our national security and resilience. And they have programs such as a Regional Resilience Assessment program that helps communities identify vulnerabilities. FEMA, of course, we all know about FEMA, has been doing disaster preparedness with communities for a long time and has developed HAZAS tools to help support assessment of community vulnerabilities. HUD focuses on housing and supporting infrastructure systems, and they provide many communities with grants to help improve the ability of their communities to provide resilient housing, and have been very active in this area in the last couple of years. EPA focuses on the resilience of your water systems, water and wastewater systems, and has tools that they have recently posted on their internet for enhancing community resilience of water systems. And NOAA focuses on coastal resilience for sea level rise and coastal storms. And the Corps of Engineers focuses on ports, waterways, and coastlines, and focuses on climate preparedness and resilience. Now, how NIST fits in with these other agencies, you have to understand the roles and responsibilities of each federal agency. They are assigned by Congress. NIST is part of the Department of Commerce, and the role that NIST plays with Commerce is to help provide the science and technology to help communities improve their commerce and their competitiveness in the nation and the world. And so we have identified a key area that needed support, which is this built infrastructure and how it performs at the community level. For nonprofit organizations, there's also two activities that have been very strongly reaching out to communities. One is the Rockefeller Foundation. They have their 100 Resilient Cities program. They work worldwide. There's about 30 of these cities within the U.S., and they provide a chief resilience officer to these communities for a 2-year period to help them get started with their resilience planning. And the Kresge Foundation has been doing a lot of work supporting climate resilience planning. And there's also national laboratories. Sandia works with the Department of Homeland Security and does regional and national assessment of critical infrastructure, including economic impacts and human behavior. Argonne, Brookhaven, Idaho, and Pacific Northwest National Laboratories are strongly funded by the Department of Energy, and they do quite a bit of work for electric power and fuel systems, including smart grid and cyber physical systems. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory focuses on renewable energy and energy efficient technologies. So you can see there's a lot of activity in resilience, but the Center of Excellence and NIST has carved out a integration of a lot of these infrastructure systems and the social systems to bring them together. Now, the NIST research activities include the community resilience work on assessment tools and metrics for communities based on systems modeling methods. We also are doing work on tornado hazard maps with a multi-year effort to create science-based maps to support tornado-resistant design. We also have our NEHRP program and seismic performance of existing buildings. And a recent example, they do much more than this, is the performance of slender concrete walls are being evaluated to lead to possible code changes after examining what happened in Chile. And building failure and collapse mitigation is a subject of research, and new connections were developed for enhanced performance with analysis tools to help reduce the probability of building failure and collapse. These are just some examples. There's much more that we're doing at NIST, but these will support the community resilience activities very strongly that are moving forward. And, of course, the next NIST-funded Center of Excellence, just at a very high level. It was awarded a year ago to a 10-institution team led by Colorado State University. It's funded at $4 million a year through a cooperative agreement, and there are 3 primary objectives that they are addressing. There's an integrated systems level model through a computational environment that will be open sourced. And of course, how do you integrate all the data from all these disciplines to work in a model? There's quantitative and qualitative data that needs to be integrated. And of course, the validation. You can't use a model or have confidence in it unless it's been validated using past events as well as future events. And the last point is that we often get asked, what are the envisioned products and end users after our 5-year funded period? The modeling environment is intended for use by researchers after 5 years, and we hope that we will have a new tool that many researchers will participate and use, as well as we plan to make available incremental tools and metrics that may be identified or developed in this 5-year period. We don't intend to hold those till the end, but to make those available to communities. And with that, I would like to pass the presentation back to Professor Van de Lindt.
Thank you, Terry. I'll now provide a brief overview of the Center of Excellence's operation, personnel, and some research challenges. Civil infrastructure is made up of a large number of interconnected, discrete, and networked and distributed systems that includes buildings, transportation networks, communications facilities and networks, power generation facilities, both electrical and gas, and water and wastewater systems. The level of susceptibility to hazards differs depending on the hazard, but also depending on the level of disaster preparedness taken by the community. Another distinct challenge recognized by the center is the coupling of discrete infrastructure, such as buildings, with network systems, such as transportation and water or wastewater. Specifically, the levels of aggregation that make the solution tractable but do not appreciably alter the accuracy of the resulting decision support that's provided. Significant research has been conducted on earthquakes over the years, and while the recent earthquakes in Japan and Ecuador remind us why, the Center of Excellence has begun investigating other equally devastating hazards. For example, between 2011 and 2013, a number of intense, long-track tornadoes devastated communities in the South and Midwest of the U.S., bringing new hazard mitigation challenges to the forefront. Within the center, we'll look at tornadoes, continue to look at earthquakes, but combine them with tsunamis, addressing the challenges of cascading hazards, as well as landslides triggered by earthquake and rainfall, hurricanes, including the effect of climate change on their intensity and occurrence rate, floods and storm surge, and wildland-urban interface fires. The common thread is that while all of these hazards cause damage to communities, there are certain attributes within communities that make them more resilient. The Center of Excellence activities focus on 3 key thrusts, namely Thrust 1, as you heard from Dr. McAllister, the development of the multidisciplinary computational environment to be known as NIST Core. Thrust 2, which focuses on standardizing data ontologies, a robust data architecture, and developing tools to support the computational environment. And then Thrust 3, the full validation of the data collection process, including its integration into NIST Core through hindcasts and extensive field studies. Today's webinar focuses on Thrust 1, which is where most of the Year 1 effort has been centered. However, upcoming webinars will focus on these 2 other equally important thrusts. Without going into too much detail, the Center of Excellence is made up of a number of key individuals across 10 universities. Not pictured here are collaborators at NIST, students, and postdoctoral fellows. This slide provides a better graphic showing the number of people involved in the center. There are a large number of postdoctoral scholars and graduate students collaborating across the partnering universities. In order to provide semi-annual and some periodic feedback, an external assessment panel provides the center researchers and NIST with written and verbal reporting related to the center's progress toward its year-end and long-term goals. The external assessment panel consists of a number of prominent individuals, each representing engineering, social science, economics, and public policy. These EAP members serve 2-year rotating terms. Current standards for risk management of physical infrastructure are handled by a large array of organizations and societies, making coordination across physical infrastructure areas a challenge because of a lack of consistency. In particular, historically, the focus has been on individual facilities, and performance measures across the differing sectors is not consistent. Treatment or handling of uncertainties has not been consistent or adequate across these sectors, making risk benchmarking difficult. In turn, this makes it difficult to compare risk mitigation strategies. We adopt the community resilience definition consistent with recent presidential policy directives and consistent with the national academies. That is, the ability of a community to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover from disruptions to its physical and non-physical infrastructure. A key aspect of the Center of Excellence's research are the ongoing modeling for the recovery phase following an event. Resilience, by its very nature, is interdisciplinary. It involves engineers, scientists from many disciplines, and stakeholders who must cooperate to ascertain whether solutions are optimal within their community's financial and social constraints. The Center of Excellence seeks to address a number of fundamental research issues, some of which include the fact that quantitative tools and metrics for assessing community resilience do not exist. Interconnected and interdependent systems must be considered to provide an accurate community model. There are numerous uncertainties that must be included for a truly risk-informed decision. The Center of Excellence has a specific task focused on uncertainty propagation to ensure accurate and consistent treatment within NIST Corps. Resilience plans are likely to be long-term plans taking place over years and even decades. Thus, as our climate changes, the ability to account for these changes within decision support algorithms is needed. Additionally, it is critical that we consider both existing infrastructure and new construction within the same framework. Many of these include systems that have been in place for decades, have varying levels of degradation, were designed at different codes and standards, representing a true fundamental challenge. And key to all of this is that codes, standards, and regulatory documents must have consistent performance goals for community resilience plans to be realized. As you heard earlier during the NIST program's overview, NIST is tasked with the development of measurement science. The Center of Excellence for Risk-Based Community Resilience Planning is a 10-university center and includes the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at Illinois. The Center of Excellence therefore seeks to quantify the factors that make communities resilient to hazards in support of the development of measurement science for community resilience. The center consists of almost 45 individual tasks, with each task being the scope of a typical academic research project. Each task has a team of researchers, including students and postdoctoral scholars, across multiple universities. There are no individual projects within the center, but rather collaborative tasks that span across multiple universities and almost always multiple disciplines. Now recall the 3 thrusts from earlier. Thrust 1 was the development of the computational environment NIST Corps. The major tasks for Thrust 1 are shown in green. These represent modeling of physical, economic, and social systems, hazards including cascading hazards and climate change, as well as dependencies and interdependencies, aging infrastructure, and the propagation of uncertainties in community resilience. Today you'll hear about many of these tasks in particular as the modeling of these physical and non-physical systems making up a community are becoming better understood. Shown in blue are the three major tasks making up Thrust 2, which focus on data ontology and management. Initial efforts have focused on understanding the user requirements and what ontologies are available and used at present. In orange are the tasks that focus on decision support algorithms within NIST core. These include social science-focused tasks, both classical and intelligent search algorithms, and community resilience test beds, the latter of which will help focus today's webinar. Not all of these tasks have begun in year one, since some require at least a beta version of the computational environment to be in place. Finally, in light blue are the tasks associated with sensitivity analysis and validation. This includes much of Thrust 3. The validation tasks will start with what we are terming a single sector validation, for example, a focus on damage and recovery of the transportation system in an affected community. Then we'll move on to coupled sector validations, where two or more sectors are coupled, eventually looking at full event hindcasting, with the first to likely be the Joplin tornado. Understanding the effects of modeling, resolution, and scaling will be critical and are the focus of specific tasks within the center. For NIST core itself, intermittent beta testing is planned beginning at the end of year 2, and a full architectural validation study will focus on the combination of all the tasks shown here, and this will be performed later in the project. A robust field studies task focusing on the development and application of a community resilience field study protocol is underway. This protocol focuses not only on field investigations immediately following an event, but follow-up studies that allow calibration of recovery models in NIST core. Additionally, surveys that link individual and collective decisions with damage and recovery of physical infrastructure have been developed and will serve as a mechanism to model the complex interaction of physical and socioeconomic recovery. Before we begin with the technical portion of today's webinar, just some brief information on the near and longer term goals of the center. This year's goals, which are the activities you'll hear about in more detail today, were to integrate models from social science, economics, and engineering with initial dependencies, to expand the hazard capabilities beyond earthquake to tornadoes, wildfires, and tsunamis. These are ongoing, but you'll see a demo of their initial implementation into NIST core. And then to establish the basic computable generalized equilibrium model for community resilience, and finally develop initial network models for many of the distributed systems. Upcoming in year 2, we plan to focus on functionality of buildings and networks, effectively defining how their dependencies may keep them from being functional during recovery, developing models for community recovery, including dependencies between all systems, and decision support algorithms within the context of the community resilience test beds. Over the life of the center and in the next few years to come, we'll complete the open source computational environment NIST core and its interfaces, creating an environment capable of integrating default and user-defined models of infrastructure components. Demonstrate the environment's capabilities for both scenario modeling and for fully coupled analysis. Utilize the center's resilience data cloud for simulations in an open source environment with two-way communication and updating. And then validate the component assemblies and environment architecture for individual hazards, multiple competing hazards, and interdependent systems using a broad spectrum of past events such as Hurricane Sandy, the Joplin tornado, and the Northridge earthquake. The series of presentations you'll see over the next 90 minutes represent the body of work resulting from the Center of Excellence's research activities over the last year. Substantial steps forward in resilience modeling and understanding key factors that make community resilient have been made, but as you'll see, many fundamental challenges remain and much of the work is in progress. And now, if there's questions, Terri McAllister and I can take questions. And Professor Hussam Mahmood will be reading some questions, and then we'll move on to the next section in a few minutes.
So there is a question that pertains to the relationship between NIST Center of Excellence in this area and the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence in terms of critical infrastructures. Do they overlap, and or do they not, and what's the relationship between them?
Okay, thank you. Right now, there's not a direct collaboration amongst those centers, but there have been some discussions, and so there are some preliminarily scheduled meetings, or at least some discussion to meet in Washington and talk about that, and that's there will be a sharing of models going both directions, things like that, but. For the most part, of course, a part of our Center of Excellence is not to reinvent models. So if there's models out there that have been developed during the past 5 or 10 years that the Department of Homeland Security centers have been in progress, we would certainly utilize those to the extent we can, and we would certainly share our models with them. So we do have some commonalities. For instance, with the Coastal Resilience Center for the Department of Homeland Security, we are also looking at hurricanes and climate change, as you'll hear later today, and so that's. So you'll see some commonalities, but there'll definitely be a sharing of models, and the discussions are ongoing. Okay, well, with that, thank you. And now I'll pass to Professor Bruce Ellingwood, co-director of the Center of Excellence, to begin the remainder of the webinar.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I want to introduce some of the test beds that we're working on right now, because I think it'll add context, to some of the work that's been ongoing within the center for the first year, and perhaps make it seem a little bit less abstract. The center researchers are in the process of developing community resilience assessment models in the context of 3 test beds. The first test bed is Centerville, which is a virtual community, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute or two. The second is Seaside, Oregon, and then we're using for a third test bed a low-resolution model of Shelby County, Tennessee, which includes the city of Memphis, and was studied a number of years ago as part of an NSF-funded Mid-America Earthquake Center study. Each one of these test beds produces some unique features and challenges to resilience assessment. Seaside, Oregon is a coastal resort community of about 6,500 inhabitants, and Seaside is threatened by great earthquakes and tsunamis emanating from the Cascadian subduction zone. Shelby County and Memphis, Tennessee is a metropolitan area, a major population and transportation hub with a population of approximately 1 million inhabitants. It's exposed to seismic events from the New Madrid seismic zone, as well as to riverine flooding. And the third community is Centerville, and I will use Centerville to illustrate some of the basic approaches that we're taking to community resilience assessment. Centerville is an imaginary community. It actually represents a composite of several communities. It's a relatively simple community with essential physical, social, and economic infrastructure systems. The Centerville test bed was devised to enable some of the fundamental algorithms that will be used in NIST to be initiated, to be developed in preliminary form, to be programmed by our NCSA colleagues at the University of Illinois, and tested at an early stage of the center research program, before the refined measurement methods and the full architecture of the NIST platform were available for this purpose. It enables us to look at combinations of physical, social, and economic infrastructure systems using relatively simple constructs that can be easily tested and verified independently. An equally important purpose of the Centerville testbed is to provide a setting for engineers and social scientists to work together from the beginning toward a common objective. And this is something that very, very rarely has happened in previous large-scale interdisciplinary centers. And so the Centerville testbed provides the structure for this interdisciplinary collaboration that will be absolutely essential for us to achieve our center goals and objectives. This is Centerville. It's a fairly simple construct. The city is approximately rectangular in size. It's about 8 miles by 5 miles in dimension. A river and a railroad run through the center of it. It's a typical middle-class city. It has a population of about 50,000 people. And there are about 20,000 households. And approximately 50% of the inhabitants own their own homes, and approximately 50% are rentals. The median household income is about $52,000 per household, which is pretty close to the national average, although there are pockets of low to moderate income families that we wanted to include so that we could test at some stage the vulnerability of local populations to various hazards. The total employment is about 30,000 people, approximately. There are several large employers in town, including a large box store, a relatively large industrial facility, and the regional hospital. There are 7 residential neighborhoods in the community, and they represent a mixture of incomes and densities, as well as a sizable mobile home park. And toward the end of this morning's section, in section 1, we'll come back and we'll talk about this a little bit in the context of a specific assessment. There are 3 public schools, 2 middle schools and a high school, fire stations, the core hospital, which serves a regional area, and which is separated by the river from the major population center in the town. And there is only limited public transportation. The topologies or the infrastructures in Centerville were selected to represent a set of distinct topologies of civil infrastructure, buildings on the one hand, transportation, water, electrical power, and telecommunications on the other hand, economic systems and social systems. And these are all the systems that are going to be pulled together in the Centerville testbed. And so with that brief introduction, I'd like to introduce Professor Paolo Gardoni, who will discuss the built environment of Centerville.
Thank you, Professor Ellingwood. In this portion of the presentation, I will talk about physical systems. The Center of Excellence considers 5 physical systems: buildings, the transportation sector, water and wastewater networks, energy and power networks, and telecommunication networks. In this portion of the presentation, I will describe the components considered in each physical system, how each physical system is analyzed, and their layout in the considered testbeds. The building task models community buildings at both the individual and inventory levels with the following objectives. 1, provide NIST score with fragility functions that describe damage and loss of functionality for existing and new buildings of various construction types and occupancies. 2, construct a multi-dimensional building classification system that supports community resilience assessment for different hazards and inventories. 3, develop in collaboration with other teams methodologies for estimating direct and indirect losses. And 4, predict building inventory recovery time and recovery trajectories. The current building inventory includes 106 building archetypes with different occupancies that could be subject to 4 different hazards. For the Centerville testbed, the building inventory contains 16 types of building shown in the table here. The building inventory statistics have been provided by the economics team. For example, in the low-income, high-density zone, there are approximately 700 single-family houses constructed between 1945 and 1970, and 77 multifamily apartment buildings of 48 units each, built in the 80s. This resolution is sufficient for testing the modules in the resilience algorithms. The objective of the transportation task is to provide models and methods that enable risk and resilience assessment of transportation systems. In particular, the task aims to 1. Develop or identify fragility and restoration models for different components of transportation networks. 2. Develop or adopt appropriate network performance metrics that support network-level restoration modeling. And 3. Integrate the models developed for component and network levels to perform comprehensive risk assessment that can ultimately support a decision-making framework for resilience enhancement. The transportation components currently considered include highway and railroad bridges, roadways, tunnels, and railroads. The considered hazards are earthquake, tsunami, flood, wind, and surge wave. The transportation network of Centerville has been used as a testbed for formulating the integrated network modeling and developing algorithms for performance metrics used in resilience assessment. Currently, we are exploring various topological and flow-based metrics that can inform risk mitigation and resilience optimization strategies. The water and wastewater task aims to develop models of the physical systems and functional service to the community, including modeling of hazard-induced loads and effects and system response during and after each hazard. Water networks support residential, commercial, and industrial functions by providing water through 5 key subsystems: supply, transmission, treatment, pumping, and storage of water. These subsystems are composed by nodal components such as demand nodes, junctions, pumping stations, tanks, and treatment plants, and by linear components such as distribution and transmission pipelines. The water network performance analysis consists of 3 main parts. 1. Modeling of the hazard, such as earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, and the assessment of the intensity measures at each site. 2. The analysis of the damage of each component in the network using fragility functions for the nodal components and repair rate functions for the linear ones. And finally, 3. The assessment of the loss of functionality considering key network-specific metrics such as, for example, water pressure and water quality. Considering Centerville, the water network consists of 14 demand nodes, 2 tanks, and 5 junctions connected by 29 large diameter pipelines. A reservoir with a treatment plant and a pumping station provides water to the system. A backup source of water is represented by the northeastern well. Small diameter distribution lines receiving water from trunk lines and distributing it to consumers are included in the demand nodes. The Energy and Power Network, EPN, task aims to develop models of the physical systems of EPN and of their functional service to the community. The EPN can be broadly divided into generation, transmission, and distribution systems. The generation system includes a power generation plant where power is generated and the voltage is stepped up by the step-up transmission substation so that the electricity can be transmitted over large distances without power loss. The transmission system carries electric power over long distances from the generating units to the distribution system. The transmission network is composed of power lines and stations and substations. Distribution systems carry power the last few miles from transmission or sub-transmission to consumers. Power is carried through wires, either on poles or in many areas underground. The main steps in the EPN performance analysis are 1. Hazard analysis, 2. EPN characterization, 3. Hazard network interaction, how the network interacts with the hazard, for example, the intersection of a tornado path and the EPN layout and the wind pressure on the components. 4. Network analysis comprising of component, connectivity, and power flow analysis. And finally, 5. Loss analysis, converting the damage into actual loss and recovery times using the loss recovery functions. Centerville has been used as a testbed also for the energy and power network. The testbed network consists of one power plant, one transmission substation, one main grid substation, two distribution substations, three sub-distribution substations, and 24 towers connected by transmission, distribution, and sub-distribution lines. This slide shows an example of EPN tornado analysis for Centerville. From the tornado path, wind speeds are computed, which are then used with the fragility functions to compute the damaged components. Using the loss function, the total loss or repair time to bring back power to selected nodes can then be calculated. The water and energy and power networks have been coupled to model the dependency of the two systems and capture the impact of the failure in one network on the functionality of the other network. With reference to the Centerville testbed, we first identified the areas of Centerville that need energy supply, namely the auxiliary pumping station, the pumping station at the central water treatment plant, and at Wellfield, and link these nodes to the energy and power network. Preliminary results show that the coupling induces a change in the damage scenario and a delay in the recovery time of selected functionality matrix. Finally, the objective of the communication task is to provide models and methods that enable risk and resilience assessment of the communication infrastructure. The communication infrastructure is comprised of physical systems that support a variety of communication technologies such as antenna structures, cellular, AM, FM, and commercial, broadcast, and private LAN mobile systems. The figure on the left shows selected communication infrastructure for Clatsop County, Oregon, in which the seaside testbed is found. Limited post-hurricane and earthquake restoration data have been used to model fragility and recovery functions. The figure on the right illustrates one such model fit to post-seismic event data. This concludes the overview on the physical systems. Our next speaker is Professor Walt Peacock. Professor Peacock is the director of the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M University and the lead of the social science team in the Center of Excellence. Professor Peacock will talk about social science models.
Thank you, Paolo. Yes, as Paolo suggested, I'm going to be addressing social science modeling. And to do that, I want to kind of give you a little overview of our approach to modeling, which is fundamentally linking together engineering models with social science models. I'm going to give you some examples of data that we're employing, some mapping tools we're developing. In particular, the mapping tools we hope will really enhance community resiliency planning, as we are reaching out into communities, but also fundamentally critical in terms of establishing some of the methods and measures that we are using in our social science models. And then I'll give you a quick example of one of our models focusing on displacement and talk a little bit about some of the other issues we're addressing. So let me start with a very simple picture, okay? A very simple way of kind of thinking about impacts from disasters. So if we think about hazard agents, we can talk about tornadoes, hurricanes, or whatever particular your particular agent of favor. And there are unique characteristics with respect to those agents, right? We can talk about the intensity issues, wind issues, and the like. Those generate physical impacts, and indeed some of the things that Dr. Gardoni was talking about in terms of the impacts on the built environment, damage to our buildings, damage to our infrastructure, and then of course deaths and injuries as well too. Those physical impacts really set into motion then social impacts. They drive much of what happens in terms of the overall social impacts, because we're losing not only valuable members of our communities, but also the stuff we use to behave each and every day to carry out our normal activities. So here are some of the kind of social impacts that we are looking at.
First and foremost, we are taking the damage data with respect to individual types of buildings and then talking about the implications for education institutions, for health and hospitals, for housing. The destruction or disruption of infrastructure is going to impact the nature of housing that we have, and it's going to impact very different types of populations in terms of addressing long-term recovery issues. We're also looking at demographic impacts, population dislocation, displacement, loss, as well as compositional changes. Extremely important. If we lose our population, the community itself is extremely vulnerable in terms of long-term resilience, as well as consequences for our economies. Indeed, if we lose those people, we lose not only our employees, but we also lose the markets, if you will. And so we are also examining business loss, interruption, failure, and the like. And then those sometimes much more subtle impacts, but nevertheless important impacts, especially for families and households, and those are psychological impacts in terms of post-traumatic stress, depression, and the like. And ultimately, as John indicated, and Terry as well too, we're really fundamentally interested in looking at long-term recovery issues, speed issues, the quality issues. Are we talking about equitable recovery? Are we talking about unequal recovery? As well as the adaptation issues. Are we recovering so that we are a stronger community after one of these events? So let me expand this simple model a little bit, because of course the disaster agent is important. But fundamentally, it's that interaction between the disaster agent and the community, the nature of the community, that's important in terms of us understanding not only the physical impacts, but especially those broader social impacts. So some of the characteristics we're looking at the community level are, of course, hazard exposures. Some parts of our community are have much more exposure than other parts. Think about floodplains, think about surge zones, think about issues along those lines. The physical vulnerabilities, my distinguished, wonderful engineering colleagues are working on those issues, trying to kind of grasp what are those physical vulnerabilities with respect to infrastructure in our buildings. And then for us as social scientists, the critical components are aspects with respect to social vulnerability. Indeed, part of what we are doing overall is really looking at the linkages, those overlaps, if you will, between hazard exposure, physical vulnerability, and social vulnerability. And indeed, for resiliency planning, we really need to be focusing on those overlap areas, because those are the weak points. Those are the hot spots that we need to be addressing in terms of our planning for long-term resilience issues. So how do we think about social vulnerability? How do we kind of get at those issues? Well, much like physical vulnerability, we're talking about the attributes or characteristics, only now we're talking about attributes and characteristics of social systems and indeed of the human population. For social scientists, we focus on those attributes that are associated with social factors and processes that generate vulnerabilities in terms of a person or a group's capacity to anticipate, cope, resist, and ultimately recover from a disaster. So we're looking at issues like race, ethnicity, wealth, gender, household composition, and the like. Those important indicators that help us understand capacity, help us understand access to information, the ability to act on that information, power, control, and indeed, ultimately, resources that are critical to engage in all types of responses with respect to disaster. Indeed, those factors determine the disparities we see in terms of differential impacts, differential ability to recover in our communities. Now, when we look at our communities, they're not all uniform, right? We know there are good sides of town, bad sides of town. We know there's safe housing, but et cetera, et cetera. We live in a very socially constructed, socioeconomically constructed environment, our social environment. And those populations and characteristics are indeed unevenly distributed in communities, and that gives us a leverage point to be able to map and capture then the social attributes that are critical for establishing social vulnerability. This table kind of shows some of the characteristics that we're looking at with respect to some of the modeling we're doing. We're using American Community Survey data, 5-year survey data from the census. We're pushing that down to the block group level, which is fundamentally important for especially community planning. Communities don't plan as a whole in terms of what's going to happen overall, but target areas. We need to be focusing on what's going on in our neighborhoods and different parts of our communities. And with this block group data, it allows us to do that. Very high resolution data. We're developing first order as well as second order, so you can see some of the characteristics we're looking at: single parent households, elder households, households in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. We're linking those together to create second order indices that can be used for particular types of planning activities, and then combining those together to form social vulnerability hotspots, if you will, that can be overlaid with physical and hazard exposure. We're developing both maps as well as then using these attributes in our modeling as well. If you look at Centerville, again, it's a very it's a virtual environment in which we are working, a very simplistic environment. We have very discrete neighborhood areas and everything. I don't know if I can get them. So, for example, Zone 1, that's a high-income, low-density area. Here's the mobile home park. Very discrete areas. And so we are building the social vulnerability issues in terms of our modeling, in particular income and race and ethnicity. But just to kind of give you a flavor of how it works in a typical kinds of area. Here we've got a map of a coastal county and with a couple critical urban areas. Havadan, you may recognize the area. Here we've got a social vulnerability map. This is a map that's mapping the characteristic with respect to single parent households with children. The darker the green, the higher the concentration of populations in those areas. And if you'll notice in the urban areas, we get very fine resolution, so very small areas, very neighborhood areas. A little bit problematic as we move out into suburban and more rural areas. So we're also developing heat density maps to actually capture where the population is in these areas. And so you can see the overlay there of the darker the blue, the higher the concentration, and you can see how that simplifies things so we know that there are concentrations in particular areas. This is an overlay with NOAA's surge data, and you can actually see then where we've got vulnerable populations to different levels of surge, so we can link those things together. Most importantly for our modeling is we're using then these data to actually then model dislocation or population dislocation. So we're taking engineering output from our engineering models in terms of damage to residential structures. We're looking at housing characteristics, social vulnerability issues then, in particular, again, it's income and race, and then occupancy rates. We're linking those together to actually come up then with very fine resolution that can be aggregated up in terms of population dislocation. The other issues that we are looking at, well, we're refining our social vulnerability data and mapping tools, continuing to work in terms of improve displacement and dislocation algorithms. We've also got working algorithms for casualty and post-traumatic stress, as well as extending the approaches to building vulnerability and business vulnerability. In addition, and importantly, we're also reaching out already to the American Planning Association, working with them in terms of working with local planners to better understand what their needs are and how our tools, how our products will facilitate their planning activities with respect to resilience. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Harvey Cutler, who is a professor in the Department of Economics here at CSU and also the head of our economics team.
Thank you, Walt. I'd like to do three things today, and the first one is just to give a brief description of our CG model, and it'll be in a flow diagram form. Then I'll focus on how we integrate the CG model with the built environment, and then the third objective is just to make some preliminary comments about mitigation policies and some of the criteria we can use to come up with an optimal mitigation policy. So the first aspect of a CG model is we have households. And for Centerville, we've just decomposed households into 7 groups distinguished by annual income, but we also have a spatial component. And I won't put up that picture of Centerville, but we have households located in 7 different areas, and we put these households in those particular groups. Then we have firms, and firms demand labor and capital, and they're also spaced, presented in a spatial component around Centerville, and they demand labor and capital. And when we have an earthquake that we looked at initially, it destroys capital, and then that would affect the functions of these firms. So what we have then, the connection between households and firms, is that households supply labor, and we have a large number of different labor groups, and in return, they'll receive wage payments from the firms, and then with those wage payments, the households will make expenditures for goods and services, and then in return, the receipt of goods and services flow back. Then we have a local government, and the government will receive taxes from households. Usually it's sales tax, property tax, and other types of taxes, depending upon the scope of the government, but this is a local government, so there's no income tax. And then in return for the tax payments, the government will supply services like police, fire, and maintaining of roads, which actually is important in our impact of natural hazards. And then in a similar way, firms pay taxes and also receive services similar to what the households receive. And then there's the outside economy, and what we have there is households will make expenditures outside the economy. So they'll buy goods and services within, but then they may make online purchases, so money will be flowing out of town. So there's leakages there. And then we have household migration. A natural disaster may affect people to move out for temporarily, so we can model that. And we also have migration in, if obviously the community is doing well. And then there's also exports for the firms. So the outside economy will purchase goods and services from firms within Centerville, and then the receipts of goods and services will go back. So this is a general description of the CG model. We have all these, probably about 1,000 equations describing how these flows occur. And Walt talked about the data, which I will not discuss today, but we have an extensive data set which actually populates this economy. And so what I'd like to do now is talk about the specifics of the CG model and how they relate to the built environment. So commercial sectors purchase labor to help produce goods and services. They also purchase physical capital, buildings, and then they also purchase intermediate inputs. So a firm may purchase from other firms, let's say a restaurant would purchase cash registers. I guess that's an old term. But I'm showing my age, I guess. And those intermediate inputs come from other sectors. And we also have these intermediate input purchases in the Centerville model spatially as well. Now, encompassing this production for these firms is a concept known as total factor productivity, and the acronym is TFP. And total factor productivity describes the ability of firms to coordinate the use of labor, physical capital, and intermediate inputs to produce output. So an increase in TFP allows firms to be more productive in using these inputs to produce outputs. So that's basically how the firms function within Centerville or any CG model. And then we also have households, and households have two sources of income, actually three, but we're just modeling two for today: wage income and then capital income. And with that, they purchase goods and services, which we described before, and then they also purchase or rent housing. So what we want to do is understand how the flow of goods and services impact both firms and households when the damage occurs. So what we've done is we've looked at all the output that the engineers are providing in terms of damages to buildings, transportation, electricity, water, and telecommunication, and then we integrate these effects into the CG model so we can look at the economic consequences. So as an example for buildings, we've looked at pretty extensively. If an earthquake damages buildings, it impacts the economy in multiple ways. First, it will impact production, because if physical capital is damaged, then production levels go down. But also, if capital is damaged, it affects household income, because households generate income from these physical capital, and also housing would be impacted if some of the homes are destroyed. So this would possibly cause people to migrate out of town or possibly seek temporary shelter. So we've got that model. And then we also have transportation, and if roads are damaged, it may impact the ability of firms to function. So it may affect total factor productivity for these sectors. So we've got that modeled. And also, it may affect the ability of households to actually travel to the different stores that they make their purchases to. So we also can model that by increasing the relative cost of actually making purchases. We also can model disruptions to electricity and water, and there's two levels that we can look at. If the water and electricity disruptions are relatively minor, then we'll model it in terms of intermediate inputs, and then the cost of that may rise. But if the damage to water and electricity is dramatic, then that might affect total factor productivity, and we can also handle that. Then the last one, telecommunications. What we're looking at now is if there's a disruption in telecommunications, we're modeling that as impacting negatively total factor productivity. But we've also envisioning possibly other connections. So that's how we've integrated the CG model with the built environment. Now what I'd like to just finish up is just make some preliminary comments just about optimal mitigation policy. So what we're looking at is what types of policies could be implemented to make a community more resilient or less sensitive to these natural hazards. And we're talking about retrofitting buildings and roads, changing building codes, or possibly encouraging people with tax policy to locate in places that are less susceptible to a disaster. And that's sometimes not as straightforward. But what we want to do is look at how these policies will impact the level and distribution of household income, the production of goods and services, population dislocation, and local government tax revenue. So what we'll do is we'll run an earthquake through Centerville as an example and look at the economic losses. Then we'll look at a possible mitigation policy where maybe commercial or residential buildings are retrofitted, run the earthquake through the model again, and then look at the reduction in losses in these four categories. So we'll look at thousands of experiments to look at the optimal mitigation policy, and then we shall evaluate what the optimal policy is. So that concludes my remarks. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Professor Ellingwood, who's going to talk about the integration of physical, social, and economic systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey. In the next 10 minutes, which will conclude the first section of our webinar, I'd like to illustrate how these physical, social, and economic systems can be integrated together to provide quantitative measures of resilience for the Centerville community. I'll touch very briefly on scenario hazards, on building damage and loss, on social and economic impact, and the decision support process. The Centerville testbed, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks to this section, has provided a structured environment for engineers and social scientists to focus on a common research task and to work together toward a common goal. And we feel that that's very, very important in terms of achieving the center objectives. Centerville is located within the reach of the New Madrid seismic zone and thus is susceptible to an earthquake hazard. The particular hazard that we're looking at right here involves a magnitude 7.8 event with an epicentral distance of approximately 40 kilometers from the center of Centerville. And it's also close to Tornado Alley, but we're going to consider primarily earthquake in this discussion this morning. The presentation will start off with a discussion of the scenario earthquake and then look at its consequences to the built environment and then the consequences of the built environment behavior on the social and economic support systems. This process is basically handled through a Monte Carlo simulation where we simulate earthquake events and then we attenuate them to the sites of the individual buildings within the Centerville community. The damages to the built environment due to the earthquake are modeled by something called a fragility. It's a concept that probably is familiar to many of you, but for those who have not seen this before, it basically reflects the uncertainty in the state of damage or the structural performance conditioned on the intensity of the demand from the natural hazard. And it provides a linkage between the performance of the physical infrastructure that we're interested in and the impact on community economic and social systems. You'll see the term fragility in several of the presentations later on this morning. This is an illustration of something called a seismic fragility, and it defines the probability of being in various damage states given a particular ground motion intensity. And the whole area of seismic fragility is relatively mature because we've been doing it for the past 20-odd years. But remember, there are many other hazards that we're considering in the center research programs. And fragilities are unavailable for most of those other hazards. And so just to note in passing that there is a significant research effort underway within the center to develop fragilities for first principles from some of the other hazards that we're considering. From this particular scenario earthquake that I just described, what you're looking at here is the structural, non-structural, and the contents damage to the Centerville building inventory. And the heaviest losses in this particular figure, in terms of dollar damage at least, tend to occur in the commercial and the retail and the industrial areas. If you look at mean damage ratio, which is expressed as the ratio of losses to assessed value, you get a slightly different picture of the damages that may occur, although there obviously is some consistency between the two of them. And this slide shows the expected losses and the loss ratios by building type and by building zone. The direct dollar losses and the loss ratios vary considerably from zone to zone. And depending on what measure is used, a somewhat different picture of damage on the community may emerge. In the case of dollar losses, simply, buildings in zone 11, which are the heavy industrial zone, represent the highest losses. In terms of loss ratio, on the other hand, buildings in zone Z9, which are the commercial and retail areas of town, represent the highest economic impact. I'll just note in passing that the mobile home park, which is zone Z7 on the slide, indicates a relatively low dollar damage, but it represents a relatively high damage in terms of relative cost, which indicates that in looking at economic losses to the community, we have to pick our metrics very carefully if we want to reflect the impact on the social and the economic conditions. I want to give a couple of examples of how this information is transformed into social and economic losses. The resilience metrics that we're looking at are basically determined by the members of our social sciences team. Professor Peacock talked about some of these. Population dislocation, employment, and domestic output and level of income are three measures that are, I guess I would call, low-hanging fruit, and we've chosen to at least start our analyses by looking at these and as we learn more about the relationship between the social, economic, and the physical systems. The resilience metrics relate to the direct physical damage to the infrastructure, to the recovery, to the economic vitality, and the social well-being of the community. And we're supported in this effort to identify appropriate metrics by another NIST-sponsored activity, which Dr. McAllister mentioned early on, the Community Resilience Panel, which actually has an entire task which is devoted to the determination of appropriate metrics for community resilience assessment. So I'm going to look at these three in my example, recognizing that there are many other metrics that over a period of time will be incorporated into the analysis. To start off with population dislocation, it can occur as a result of at least two sources. First of all, it can occur as a result of damage to the built environment, which may render the housing unoccupiable. Or it could also occur by damage due to the commercial retail areas of town, which destroy jobs and force people to move elsewhere to find employment. So there are a couple of sources that need to be considered. There are several models that are available, and the impacts on population dislocation, at least by zone, shown in this study here, in this particular example, correspond to short-term dislocations from residential zones. And if you look at these across the spectrum here, I know you won't remember what the zones are unless you have a map of Centerville side by side. But the dislocation from the residential zone Z1 is the highest, and that happens to be the zone involving the high-income, low-density residential housing. And so the fact that the relocation is relatively high there presumably occurs because of the fact that the people that live there have more alternatives available to them than people in other parts of town. The relocation is low in the trailer park, and this is a consequence, of course, of the models that are being used in the analysis, which are still under development. What I want you to take away from this slide, a takeaway, is the fact that the current HAZUS models underestimate the dislocation in all of the residential zones, at least in comparison to the models that our social sciences team is working with. Professor Cutler mentioned the computable general equilibrium model, and we can, in fact, use these models to determine the impact of this particular scenario earthquake on the Centerville community. And here's a simple example of this analysis. Let's suppose that no pre-event mitigation actually takes place. And at the present time, this, in fact, might be a very common scenario. At any rate, the changes in our key economic metrics in absolute terms and in terms of relative percentage change, given the occurrence of that scenario earthquake, are shown in the second and the third columns of this table. And so we can use, this is a very simple example of how that CGE model might be used to determine the impact of a potential event in pre-event planning in a community. If we want to take it a little bit further and actually consider possible decisions that might occur as a result of that, we have to move the analysis one step further, and in the next few slides I will give you a very simple illustration of a pre-decision event decision analysis. And this decision analysis basically involves mitigation resource allocation. How do you best spend the resources available to you to take actions prior to the event to minimize its impact? And the mitigation example that I'm going to present involves code improvements to mitigate impact, both to tax revenues and to dislocation. And so the specific program or the problem that we're looking at is we want to allocate limited resources to retrofit building types in various zones to specific code levels. And we have two objectives. One is to minimize the economic losses to the structural and non-structural components and contents. And the second is to minimize the total dislocation of the population. And these are competing objectives. They can't both be satisfied at the same time. And the constraint is that we not, whatever mitigation strategy we select, that it not have an undue impact on vulnerable populations within the community. And so this is a very simple example of a decision support analysis. And so this is the baseline here. The total economic losses to the community due to this particular event are about $850 million in the dislocation. And we're going to look at strategies, three different strategies involving three different budget levels in this particular problem, just to get some idea as to how the decision might be affected by the budgets that are available to do this analysis. The economic losses and the population dislocations, by the way, in this example, were presented from an integrated engineering and social science and economic analysis, similar to the one that I just described. And so, as I say, it involves competing objectives, and the competing objectives are cost and dislocation. And there are three different policies or budget policies that are represented by the three slides. And then this is what's referred to as a Pareto front in multi-objective optimization. And there are three possible policies that we might select for further consideration. And as I mentioned, there is no unique solution to a problem like this, and selecting the appropriate solution actually involves the value systems and the preferences of the community and the decision makers within it. So I want to look at those three a little bit more carefully along the that upper curve, which represents the 15% budget expenditure. So if you look at policy number 1, for example, and if you break it down, this is a policy that favors low dislocation over low cost. And if you do this particular policy, your losses to the community reduce from about $850 million down to about $640 million, and the dislocation decreases from 2,300 down to 1,400. And this little slide shows how that policy is translated into rehabilitation and retrofit to code levels in each of the building zones within the community. And if you look at the three different policies, you'll see what the impact is of all three different policies is on employment, domestic output, and on household income. And the changes from the baseline conditions are provided by those three alternative policies. What they show, and this I think is very interesting, is that they show the employment, the output, and the household income are affected by these policies to somewhat different degrees. So that suggests that the competing objectives, have to be resolved in some way with the value system and the preferences of the community. In other words, the decision algorithm support that we're providing in NIST core does not automate the decision process. It provides the decision maker with the information necessary to make a risk-informed decision that's consistent with his or her knowledge of the community civil infrastructure and its social and economic institutions and value systems. And so in the Centerville exercise to date, we have already tested our interfaces between our physical, social, and economic systems with some relatively simple, manageable examples. We are in the process of performing an analysis of Centerville for the tornado hazard, which is also a hazard to which Centerville is vulnerable. We are moving towards similar coupled analyses for Seaside, where the coupled effects of earthquake and tsunami are being considered. And to Shelby County, Tennessee, where the hazards considered are the combination of earthquake and riverine flooding, the latter of which may very well be affected by climate change, and we're considering those. The studies that we have performed to date focus on pre-disaster planning and basically the prompt effects of the natural hazard. We have initiated work on recovery. And as John mentioned in his introductory remarks, that work on recovery will be one of the major thrusts during year 2, and work in that area will accelerate, not only for Centerville, but for some of the other test beds that we are considering. So this presentation concludes the presentation for the first section. We have time for some questions now before we move into the break. And so I'll ask Professor Mahmood, who is our webinar scribe, to take those questions. Thank you.
Right, so we have time for a few questions. There's a question for Dr. Gardoni, Professor Gardoni. One of the questions is how do you capture data on a community's dependencies, interdependencies, and sole points of vulnerability so that you can reuse the data in various models? And if you could please repeat the question because this mic is not linked to the... Sure. How do you capture data on a community's dependencies? All right, I'll read the question.
All right.
It's the one marked red.
Perfect. Thank you. So the question is, how do you capture data on a community's dependencies, interdependencies, and sole points of vulnerability so that you can reuse the data in various models? Okay. I think this is a great question, and I'm not sure who asked, but I want to thank the who asked the question, because it really points to one of the key features, one of the novelty aspect of the Center of Excellence, that is the modeling of the dependency and interdependencies of physical system, and there's not been much work done on this field. So this is really something that is new that we're putting forward. So it gives you an opportunity to expand a little bit on that. To answer the question specifically, the basic idea is that the more integrated, the more dependent or interdependent the systems are, the more there is a need to look at reality and use actual field data that can help us calibrate the models and calibrate the nested models that have been used for capturing the dependencies and interdependencies. And this points to the importance of the testbed, in particular the testbed on actual communities, and also points to the importance of the hindcasting that we are planning to do in the near future. This, if you want, is a short answer to the question. Later this morning, in the second part of the webinar, there will be a presentation by Professor Dorothy Reed, fully devoted to dependencies and interdependencies. So you'll hear more details in that part of the presentation. Thank you.
There's a question that was directed to me. Will performance in terms of hazards be done for the hazard singly or in combination as well? In the mid-Atlantic, for example, South Carolina and Georgia, the infrastructures are subjected to several hazards. And the answer to that question is an emphatic yes. In the first year, we have focused our attention on getting the best physics-based models that we possibly could get for the hazards individually, because that has to be the starting point. But in the second year, we are shifting our attention to examination of interdependent or coupled or cascading hazards. The work in the seaside testbed, in fact, is tailor-made to look at that type of an analysis where you're looking at the combination of earthquake and tsunami, and that's for the first time in the center. We're also moving toward, we have a task that deals with interdependent and cascading hazards, which is gearing up. And third, we have a task that's related to climate change, in which hazards such as, coupled hurricane precipitation, surge, inundation, and coastal flooding are all being considered together in an integrated approach. So we will move toward emphasizing, in fact, the interdependent or the cascading hazards in year 2, but we felt it was appropriate to make absolutely certain that we had good state-of-the-art models of the individual hazards in year 1, and so that's where we started our analysis.
All right, I have a question that is, what sorts of data collection methods are used? Only census or interviews, focus groups, etc.? Well, actually, it's a great question. We're using all of those. Fortunately, many of us have been involved in long-term research activities, often funded by the National Science Foundation and NOAA. So we're utilizing those primary data that we've collected. We've also got folks that love secondary data from census, et cetera, and so we're combining data from those sources, and we have solid qualitative folks involved as well too, that are doing very intensive focus groups and qualitative work with communities and different parts of the community. So we're trying to link all of those different data together, which of course there are all types of uncertainties and issues like that that we are grappling with. In addition, and I think one of the wonderful aspects of this cooperative endeavor is that we will be engaged in field research as well too. Dr. Van der Lindt mentioned that if there is an event, then we will activate and be going out and collecting data. Some of the kinds of data that we're focusing on, at least from the social science team, will be issues like on the dislocation consequences, issues like the beginning stages of recovery, and then kind of refining data that we have to provide and supplement work that we've already engaged in.
My question concerns transfer payments and how do transfer payments help the recovery of a community? And actually, this question is what we're talking about this afternoon. But in the recovery process, what we can model is the infusion of insurance money and FEMA money. And depending upon how the FEMA money is distributed around a community will impact who recovers quicker. So the example in the question was New Orleans, which hasn't recovered particularly well. So we could model how resources from FEMA are coming in to different parts of the community. So we can address this, but again, it's a great question, but we're dealing with this specifically this afternoon. But thank you.
That concludes a short question and answer period. We'll now have a 15-minute recess, and the webinar will resume promptly at 10:45 a.m. Mountain Time. Thank you for your attention.
take your seats, please. Okay, well, for those of you on the webinar, welcome back to the webinar, Supporting Community Resilience. We're going to continue. And so our next presentation section 2, is on community synthesis and hazard. With that, I'd like to introduce Professor Dan Cox from Oregon State University, who's also an associate director for the Center of Excellence. He'll talk to you about hazards and damage. Dan?
Okay, thank you, John. Just bringing up the notes, one second. Okay, thank you, and good morning. It's my pleasure to talk to you a little bit about natural hazards and damage in a general context. Right now, researchers here at the center are developing probabilistic natural hazard models to support all the other center tasks that you're hearing about. As Bruce mentioned, for some of these hazards, for example, earthquakes and hurricanes, some of these methods are fairly well developed, but for others, such as tornadoes, wildfires, much less well developed, and there's been a lot of work here in the center. We also need to consider cascading hazards such as tsunamis and landslides following earthquakes, and the joint occurrence of hazards such as wind, surge, and waves coupled with rain and inland flooding. In this portion of the seminar, we'll summarize some of our Year 1 accomplishments, particularly in tornadoes, tsunamis, and wildland-urban interface, or WUI fires. We'll show you how these hazard intensities are used in a fragility analysis to estimate damage to the built environment. And much of this work has already been incorporated in NIST core, and Dr. Lee will demonstrate 3 example scenarios a little bit later in this webinar. So tornadoes. First, tornadoes have caused significant damage to communities all over the U.S. or throughout the U.S. In the last 5 years, but particularly in places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Joplin, Missouri, and Moore, Oklahoma. There are approximately 1,200 tornadoes each year, almost all of these large tornadoes occurring east of the Rocky Mountains in Tornado Alley and the recently termed Dixie Alley. These tornadoes differ from historic Midwest tornadoes in that they're large, long-track tornadoes and often impact more than one community. This figure shows all of the U.S. tornado tracks occurring over the past 35 years. The red and the pink lines show the long-track EF4 and EF5 tornadoes, many of which are concentrated in the southeastern United States. Using this historical record, a probabilistic tornado analysis was used to quantify the likelihood of tornadoes of varying intensities throughout the U.S. This is the first update to tornado hazard mapping in nearly 45 years, and the center is implementing these probabilistic hazard maps into NIST core. In addition to providing the basis for our work, these results can also be used for practicing engineers. Although tornadoes are not currently considered in design codes, ASCE 716 now includes tornado commentary for protecting life safety for the more intense tornadoes and for reducing structural damage for the less intense ones. In addition to the intensity, tornado track width, length, and path are all important characteristics that can lead to community damage. Starting with this tornado database shown earlier, we're conducting an analysis of several tornado scenarios as shown in this figure on the right. Although it's highly idealized, this represents a new methodology for physics-based tornado hazard analysis and captures the tornado intensities better than the standard EF ratings. The figure on the left shows a conceptual example of how we're transforming a uniform EF4 tornado into one with varying degrees of intensity along its track width and then again along its track length. Ultimately, we're able to model stochastic variations in tornado width, length, and direction in this core, as shown conceptually on the right. At this point, we're utilizing the statistical information for different scenarios in our Centerville test bed. This figure shows an example of how a tornado can be specified by the user in NIST core using this test bed with an overlay of the electrical power network that Professor Gardoni had spoken about earlier. Dr. Lee will give this as his first demonstration in the NIST core scenarios. This figure shows how we can evaluate a range of tornado conditions. Here, only the starting point is specified, and the random length, width, and angles are based on the historical database shown earlier. This enables a Monte Carlo simulation approach for tornado path, if that's desired. To determine the level of damage and loss of infrastructure, a fragility methodology is used, as Bruce had mentioned earlier. For this example, figure A relates the tornado wind speed to the probability of a given damaged state. The damaged state varies from a slight damage, shown by the blue line, to complete damage, shown by the black line. From there, figure B shows how we're able to compute the loss probability. This result, for example, is for a $200,000 house valuation. The analysis is computed with a full assembly-based vulnerability analysis for the structure, and then we take it to the system level for the loss computations. Moving on to tsunamis following earthquakes. Although as mentioned earlier, damage and loss model estimates for earthquakes have been in development for about 2 decades, but it's only recently that the cascading effects from earthquakes such as tsunamis and landslides are being considered in these damage models. Several major tsunami disasters over the last 10 years, including the Tohoku 2011 event pictured here, provide examples of the impact of the tsunami inundation on the built environment. Here in the Pacific Northwest, the probability of a full rupture event along the Cascadia subduction zone, or the really big one, as the recent New York article termed it, stands at about 20% in the next 50 years. The figure on the left shows the proximity of this Cascadia subduction zone to the U.S. coast, less than 50 miles in some places, which will cause a tsunami to reach our coast in 15 to 30 minutes and can produce a tsunami well over 30 feet high in many places. The figure on the right shows an aerial view of the Testbed community, Seaside, Oregon. We're using NOAA's Comet MOST model in a series of nested grids to quantify the inundation hazard for our testbed community, tracking 5 intensity measures everywhere in the inundation zone. The arrival time and the duration are most closely coupled to life safety. Flow depth, flow speed, and momentum flux are related to tsunami damage and loss. We utilize a 10,000-year geological record to create a logic tree for defining the slip distributions along the subduction zone. We use a weighted probability of each event, and we can construct an annual exceedance probability for a number of intensity measures everywhere in the inundation zone for a community. For the example shown on the right, the 1,000-year flow depth at the shoreline is about 9 meters, or 30 feet. These images show how we can define for the first time the hazard levels for different intensities everywhere in this inundation zone and relate it to the recurrence interval, consistent with other types of hazards such as earthquakes and hurricanes. Our center is also developing a new methodology to characterize structures in the built environment. Here we're showing how we use a tax lot database, Google Street View, and rapid visual screening following a FEMA methodology to classify buildings based on their construction material, number of floors, and the seismic code that was enforced during their construction. Similar to the tornado example, we can estimate building damage by combining our hazard analysis and our characterization of the building stock with existing empirical fragility curves from the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. We're using this to estimate, for example, the probability of complete damage for each building at a tax lot scale, as shown on the right. From there, we can extend this analysis for the entire community. And here we see that the damage pattern varies as the tsunami intensity varies across the landscape and with the characteristics of the built environment. Dr. Lee will demonstrate the implementation of this tsunami damage module in NIST in his second scenario later. One of the main purposes of this test bed was to look at multi-hazards. Here we can use our existing knowledge of earthquake fragilities to develop this multi-hazard analysis considering the combined effects of earthquakes and tsunamis. The figures on the left show the tsunami damage on the top and earthquake damage on the right. You can notice that there's a fairly uniform distribution of damage due to the earthquake, due to that nature of the hazard, whereas the tsunami has sharp gradation from left to right. The figure on the right shows the combined damage. And then from there, we can go to loss estimation using the same tax lot database. In this case, we're showing that the direct loss is due to the combined effect of an earthquake and tsunami for a magnitude 9 Cascadia event are in excess of $1 billion for this community. Wildland-urban interface fires represent a major natural hazard for the U.S. Costs to fight wildfires have tripled since the 1990s, and wildfire risks are increasing because of global climate change. In year one, our center developed a new probabilistic framework for evaluating the WUI fire hazard and its impact on communities. Our methodology captures fire propagation in both the wildland and within a community, and is designed so that it can be used in a Monte Carlo simulation approach similar to the tornado methodology. So first, the fire propagates in the wildland, accounting for ember attack, wind speed and direction, humidity, vegetation, and other factors. After propagating the wildland fire, the edges or boundaries are used to define the ignition probability lines, or IPLs. In this example, a neighboring community is at the interface of the east IPL, and Dr. Lee will demonstrate the implementation of this new methodology in this core in his third scenario demonstration. We've also developed a wildfire propagation model for within the community. In step one, we identify the ignitable objects and boundary nodes to develop the corresponding paths. In step two, we calculate the weights of each path edge. In step three, we identify the most probable path, and in step four, we calculate the probability of the most probable path for each boundary node. In year two of our center, we'll couple the wildland and the urban fire modules. In year two of our center, we will start to incorporate other natural hazards. I'll touch on a few of these so you can see the future direction of our center. For hurricane wind, surge, and wave hazard, initially we will leverage the existing coastal hazards system database of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to define the hurricane hazard for the east U.S. coast and Gulf Coast. The CHS is developed using thousands of hurricane scenarios and provides an easily accessible database with storm surge, water level, wave height period, and direction and current magnitudes. The figure on the right, for example, shows the annual exceedance probability of water levels at Battery Park in New York due to hurricanes. Similarly, federal and state agencies have been identifying landslide hazards throughout the U.S., and efforts are underway by these agencies to make this information accessible too. The figure on the left, for example, shows a landslide probability map for Clatsop County, Oregon, and will incorporate the landslide hazards in year two of our center to define potential loss of the road network, communications, and other lifelines for the seaside testbed. Related to multi-hazards, part of our center's efforts in year two will be to include earthquake main shock and aftershock hazards. This sequence of photos, for example, shows a building in Christchurch, New Zealand that had survived the main shock and the first large aftershock in February 2011. And had suffered some damage. The building collapsed later due to a second large aftershock 4 months after the first. Finally, our center is developing state-of-the-art for multi-hazard fragility analysis. The top sequence of figures shows one of our new methodologies for combining earthquake and tsunami hazards into a single fragility function. The bottom figure illustrates fragility surfaces that we're developing for multiple intensity measures and for the joint occurrence of two hazards. So this concludes the portion on hazards and damage, and I'd like to thank John and the center for helping to put this one together, and I'd like to introduce next Dorothy Reed, professor, University of Washington, and she'll talk about interdependencies.
Thank you, Dan. I will present the first-year modeling results for interdependency. We are defining interdependency as a relationship between two or more components, networks, or systems. During the first year, we focused on civil infrastructure systems. Our modeling approaches were 1, unified directed graphs, 2, linked directed graph networks, and 3, linked system-level input-output models. On the left-hand side of the slide, we show that the physical infrastructure can be thought of as an interdependent system of systems. The so-called big three lifelines are energy, transportation, and utilities, including water systems. As shown in the right-hand side figure, the data were geocoded in our approaches at appropriate scales in order to model the site-specific effects of the applied loadings. The common characteristics of all models are fragilities and recovery functions. Fragility is defined here as the conditional probability of failure of a component, network, or system given an applied demand, such as the peak ground acceleration, or PGA, as shown in the left-hand side figure. Recovery curves illustrate the behavior of the physical system or functionality over time. Functionality is often called operability, which ranges from 0 to 100%. The curves are based on the structural integrity of the modeled physical unit, whether it is a line, substation, or other entity, and the operability depends completely on the ability of the system to deliver a service such as power or water. The inoperability curve, or X of t, which ranges from 100% non-functioning to 0% or fully functioning, is easier to model mathematically, so it is often used. In both curves on the right-hand side of the slide, the so-called resilience triangle is shown. Minimization of the triangle is considered a strategy to maximize resiliency. This slide illustrates the first-year achievements and plans for the future. The fragilities and restoration of limited groups of interlinked components and systems have been developed using unified directed graphs, linked directed graph networks, and linked system-level input-output models. In the future, we plan to link the physical models to the social and economic ones in order to capture the effects of the infrastructure performance on community recovery. The first approach that we will present is the unified directed graph approach. 6 major features of the interdependency model using this approach are introduced in the next several slides. First, the approach is based on dynamic inoperability input-output model, or the acronym DIIM. Second, the damage of a node is identified considering both the input-output requirement of each node and the relationship between the nodal operability and the physical integrity of the node. As an initial step, the physical damage of a node is determined by considering its physical vulnerability to a specified hazard. The initial inoperability of the node is determined by considering the relationship between the operability and the physical integrity. Then the inoperability of the damaged node is updated by considering the minimum required input and output. The inoperability of all nodes is determined by considering the node-to-node dependency. The last 3 steps are repeated for the duration of the simulation. This slide illustrates how the damage of one node propagates through the network. For simplicity, we assume only one node, in this example, node 2, is physically damaged from a hazard. Operability of node 2 can then be determined from the physical damage. If the operability and the output from node 2 is below the minimum requirement of the operation of the facility associated with the node, we assume that the node is not functional at all. Then this inoperability of node 2 is propagated, and node 3, which is fully dependent on node 2, is damaged. Then the operability of nodes 3 and 4 is determined solely based on the dynamic inoperability input-output model. Similarly, as for node 2, the minimum required output is used to determine the total damage of node 3. One distinguishing feature of this approach is that this model incorporates node-to-node level across-system dependency. By modeling the DIIM, the dependency between any 2 nodes is determined by considering the importance of a node to produce a service and the importance of the service in the operation of another node, as illustrated in the figure. Based on this directed graph approach, inoperability or operability of the individual systems can be determined by using network characteristic parameters such as connectivity and efficiency. For the calculations, the output links of the fully damaged nodes are removed since they become non-functional. This operability or inoperability of the individual systems may be used in decision-making as inputs for the modeling of socio-economic system damage, and recovery. Now we will turn our attention to the second approach, the directed graph network, where linkages are modeled through a matrix. This figure shows the electric power network plus water layer network for Centerville. The three rectangles highlight the region of dependency of the water system on the power system through pump station nodes that require power. The linking of the two networks is implemented through a connectivity matrix based on graph theory. The target nodes for the electric power network analysis are the nodes which supply power, that is, nodes 14, 15, and 28 in the figure to pump stations. Output of the power network is one of the inputs for the water analysis. The third method is the system-level resiliency-based interdependency approach, or RBIA. In this approach, the similarities between risk and resiliency formulations can be seen. Risk is shown here as a Venn diagram of hazards, vulnerabilities, and consequences. Interdependency affects each of these three in different ways. We begin with the fragility and recovery relationships derived from post-event in situ data from the literature and combine these to obtain relationships relevant to expected hazards. Then we obtain coefficients relating other systems to power system recovery. We then combine these with appropriate lag times to obtain a set of interdependent recovery curves. The results of RBIA modeling are illustrated in this schematic. The resiliency curves are shown as color-coded with the risk formulation to indicate the effects of interdependencies on the hazards that are shown in purple for pre-event, event, and post-event recovery. Vulnerabilities are shown in green, and consequences are shown in red over time. Fragilities are represented at or near time t equals 0. The inoperability per system illustrates the consequences over time. The role of interdependency changes for pre-event, during, and post-event recovery. In summary, we have developed three approaches to modeling interdependent fragilities and recovery functions for selected infrastructure systems. In the future, we plan to expand the models to other linked lifelines and examine the models for sensitivities. We also plan to develop ways to identify how interdependency plays a role in modeling the influence of the physical and functional models of infrastructure and social acceptance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Hussam, I think we have I think at least one or a few questions, and then just a reminder for those of you on the webinar, for the questions that we don't answer, we'll answer as many as we can in the Q&A session with the time we have left before noon Mountain Time. And then we'll also provide written responses to as many as we can, or most likely all of them, within about 10 days to 2 weeks following the webinar, and post those on the website. So,
so we have one question for Dan.
So the question is about the tornado hazard maps and whether or not these are published, and the answer is yes. It's in the Journal of Structural Engineering, and we'll provide a full reference at the end of the webinar.
And we have another question for Dorothy.
The question is, how is system degradation versus complete outage being addressed? We have 3 different methods. I know that for the system level degradation, the RBIA does look at less than 100% complete outage. I think in the other networks, they're geocoded to have something less than complete outage. But I think that, yes, the degradation is being addressed at the system level versus the complete outage over time.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan and Dorothy, and thank you, everyone, for your questions. So with that, we'll move on to presentation 3. This is our last section, and entitled "The Path Forward." In this section, Dr. Zhong Li will give a NIST core demonstration now, and then pass to Bruce Ellingwood to give a recap and next steps moving forward with a focus on year 2. And then we'll again, a reminder, we'll answer as many questions as we can following these 2 presentations. So, Dr. Li.
Thank you, John. Okay, I'm going to give you a NIST Core version 1 demo today. And as you know, I think there's several indication and also explanation about NIST Core. So NIST Core is the computational platform for NIST Center of Excellence research here. And this demo also shows how the platform can integrate different researches done by different groups. So it will provide you a consistent user interface and also later allowing to connect to different analysis. For information, these implementations are based on the latest research of the center, and some of the scientific explanation already explained previous sessions. So in this demo, we have 3 hazards are covered. First is tornado, and second is a tsunami. Third one is wildfire. Depending on some of the achievement throughout the first year of the research, some hazard has more damage analysis. Some hazard has still research on hazard propagation. So first hazard we show you the demo is tornado. So in this demo, you're going to see how to create a scenario tornado in Shelby County, and we're going to also estimate the building damage, and we're going to estimate electric power network damage for Centerville. So here is a demo. So first, we're going to execute the analysis for scenario tornado. And then you're going to see that there's various analysis you're able to select from the dialog box. And after you select, you're going to have this user interface to specify the parameters. Give the result name and then methodology, this case random width, and we'll select the EF rating, which is EF5 for this case. And then you're going to pick a tornado path on the map, giving the start and end point. Then it will generate the latitude and longitude of the starting and end point. And then we give the 10 number. 10 is a simulation number. And we execute the analysis, and it generates the wind speed zone for this tornado analysis. So this is the color code for EF ratings. And each polygon represents the wind speed zone by EF rating. So also, you are able to see attribute table of each polygon, which represent wind speed too. So based on this scenario tornado, we're going to run the building damage analysis. So similarly, you can also execute the building damage analysis. And beforehand, we're going to load the building inventory, which is multifamily. And execute the building damage analysis from the analysis list. And this is similar user interface. Now you specify result name, select the building inventory, and then select the scenario tornado you just created before. And then you need to set the fragility curve setting in these parameters. And now you execute, then analysis run each building's damage. Then let's look at the results. So you are able to see the results are populated around also the tornado path. And there's a mean damage are color-coded in each building. Let's zoom in. And in order to see more damage, let's change the map style. And you will see that there's a damages happen on the path of the tornado in this case. You are also able to see detailed information of these damages in the table view, including different damage states and mean damages and any other information calculated from this analysis. This one is Centerville, so we're going to do electric power network analysis. This is the electric power network network we have in the Centerville, and let's execute the analysis. So we can select the analysis from this dialog box. And similarly, you are able to specify these parameters. You give the result name, for this case for Lincoln nodes, and then select the electric power network we just loaded. And then we're going to create the tornado because we don't have it yet. So if you click on the tornado analysis, similarly, you could specify the result name and then methodology, which is random width, and the EF rating, EF5. And then now select the path on the Centerville. Like that. And then number of simulation is 10. And then you are able to execute this analysis, and what happened is it executes these two analyses at the same time. Let's look at the results. So now you see that there is a wind field for this tornado in the Centerville, and you are able to see some of the nodes in an electric power network has damaged. Note is each node has a cumulative damage based on electric power flow. So that's why there's a red node outside of the path. And this is also the attribute table shows all those damages on this node. So we're going to also see that some of the damages happen on each link. So now it shows the attribute table of the electric power network links. This also shows the damages on each link. So that concludes the first demonstration for the tornado. And then second demo is for tsunami. So this case, based on the tsunami researches, we're going to ingest the tsunami hazard. This demo shows the maximum moment flux in 1,000-year events for Seaside, Oregon. Then using this tsunami hazard, we are estimate the building damage. So here's a demo. So we're going to ingest the data set. So first you need to select what kind of data set is. This is raster data, so you just select the file type. Then select the actual file we received from the research group. And then next, now you select what the data type is. This case, moment flux raster data. Then you need to select the unit of this raster data. And then give the name of the data set. And click OK, then it'll ingest the data set into the NIST core platform. So let's look at this data we ingested into the system. So here is the data set. We're going to loading that into the system. So you're able to see moment flux hazard around the Seaside, Oregon. Now we're loading the building inventory data. This building inventory data constructed based on the text lot. And now we're going to do building damage analysis using the tsunami hazard we loaded. So consistent user interface also give you idea that you're going to select required data set here. First, the building inventory. Second is the tsunami hazard we just ingested. And then thirdly, building fragility curve. So after you set those parameters, now you are also able to execute analysis. It estimates the building damage on the Seaside, Oregon. So these are the building damages happened due to the tsunami hazard. So let's zoom in the area to see more detail of the building damage. So in order to see the better visualization, let's change the visualization. So you can see many buildings has damages around the seashore. And also you are able to see detailed damages of each building in this table view in terms of different damage states and mean damage, also standard deviation of this damage calculation. So that concludes the second demo. Third one is wildfire propagation. So in this demo, we're creating the wildfire hazard, which is wildfire propagation. And then note that this is the first data set we actually developed it. It contains both the spatial and temporal data within one data set. So here's the demo. So let's execute the build wildfire hazard. In order to execute wildfire hazard, it requires two data sets. The first one is DEM, which is elevation data. Second is the land cover data. So now we're selecting the elevation data for Centerville, and also selecting the land cover data for this analysis. Land cover contains information of where the water is, where the forest is. Next is now we're selecting ignition point of the fire. So we select the top of the mountain. And we execute. That it generates a 200 time step of how the wildfire can propagate throughout the region. After we finish that, and the result and store under scenario data, so expanding the folder, and you are able to see the result. So let's visualize it. So now you play it. Now you can see that wildfire is propagating. So the flickering because of the video clip frame rate. Now you are able to moving back and forth the time slide, you are able to see that how this propagate happens. And also this model has an amber attack. So you maybe it's too small to see it, but there's area that you're able to see that amber attack happens on that area. So that concludes the demonstration of the NIST Core version 1 beta so far. And then next, Professor Ellingwood is going to discuss about the path forward in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes or so just kind of summarizing where we've been and talking about major accomplishments during the first year and giving you some ideas to where we're going in the second year and beyond. In the first year, the center and its research teams have made major advances in developing measurement science that's essential for understanding what makes a community resilient and for developing risk-informed decision support tools for use for both looking at strategies for advancing or enhancing resilience in advance of an extreme event, as well as for planning for an orderly recovery should that extreme event occur. And I'd like to recap just a few of our major accomplishments and then talk about what we plan to do in the coming years. In the first year, in the area of hazards and infrastructure performance, we've modeled a variety of hazards that have not been modeled previously in the context of community resilience studies, including tornado, tsunami, wild and urban interface fires, some riverine flooding. We've been treating the hazards and the infrastructure system response to those hazard demands probabilistically in order to capture the uncertainties in the behavior. We have reassessed previously developed fragility models and have extended our fragility assessments to new hazards and to performance states other than those for life safety or collapse prevention. We have developed refined network models and have initiated research on recovery sequences and durations and on climate change effects in civil infrastructure, which will accelerate in the coming year. In the area of integrated system modeling and risk-informed decision, excuse me, we have shown this morning how we've developed physical models of community infrastructure, buildings and bridges, transportation, utility networks, systems, models of social support systems necessary for social well-being, and economic models that reflect the impact of a disaster on personal income streams, revenue and productivity and capital. We've suggested how dependencies and interdependencies between physical systems and between physical and socioeconomic systems can be taken into account. We've taken the first steps toward standardizing our databases to facilitate seamless communication in support of resilience assessment, and have demonstrated the feasibility of incorporating individual hazards and fragility modules into the NIST core platform for practical decision support purposes. We've evaluated the practicality of decision algorithms that involve competing resilience objectives. We have done much of this developmental work in the context of integrating community testbeds, which have provided the essential structure for our interdisciplinary teams to work together toward a common purpose at an early stage in the Center research program. I hope that you'll agree that the Center has accomplished a great deal in its first year. We've pulled together an outstanding team of more than 100 individuals, faculty, graduate students, postdocs, NIST collaborators, and yes, indeed, external assessment panel members. And one of the most exciting things for me as the co-director has been to work with this very talented group and to be part of this enterprise. But having accomplished a good deal, I think we have a great deal to do in our path forward. And the path forward I've identified will show some of the things that we want to do. The Center programs in year 2 and beyond will move forward from determining what is feasible to determining what is possible and indeed practical for real communities. Now, I would like to touch upon some of the challenges that face us in 5 areas. Hazard modeling, system performance, functionality, recovery, climate change, and finally, decision support algorithms. These challenges are derived or drawn from a comprehensive list that was recently assembled by the Center investigators, and there are far more than I can discuss this morning in my time allotted, so I'll just mention a few of the highlights of what we're looking at doing. In the area of hazard and community systems performance, as I mentioned in response to an inquiry from a webinar participant, the focus during the first year was on modeling individual hazards accurately and for accounting for uncertainties in frequency of occurrence and in intensity. Work in the second year will shift toward modeling coupled or cascading effects, determining joint probability distributions for multivariate or multiple hazards, and obtaining the needed statistical data to support these models, including special loads that may be sources of significant damage but traditionally have not been considered in civil infrastructure performance assessment, and determining appropriate temporal and spatial resolutions for modeling these natural hazards for community resilience assessment purposes. In the area of functionality, most previous civil infrastructure risk assessment has understandably has emphasized life safety. This is natural because that's the focus of our building codes in the United States. But knowledge of the functionality of physical and social systems within a community is absolutely essential to understand the factors that make a community resilient. The work on functionality of physical systems, which initiated in year 1, will continue in year 2 and will be extended to interfacing social economic systems and in determining the relationship between functional recovery of physical systems within a community and the community restoration patterns which may evolve social and economic components as well. In the area of recovery, studies to model recovery have initiated late in year 1 of the center. But with many of the physical models of infrastructure systems now in place from year 1 research, we are in a position to turn to modeling the recovery of physical and social and economic systems, striving to understand the interaction between these systems at different stages of the recovery process. developing recovery models at appropriate spatial and temporal scales, and investigating strategies for optimizing the recovery process. The reality of climate change must be considered in any long-term program to enhance community resilience. And during the first year, we have started in this area conducting a brief study of the impact of climate change on flood elevation and stream flow velocity in the Wolf River Basin in Shelby County, Tennessee, which will be utilized in the Shelby County Testbed as we move forward. But the work on climate change will accelerate in years 2 and 3 with work to develop coupled models of hurricane, storm surge, wave, flooding, precipitation in a coastal community to be identified shortly, toward developing computationally efficient methods and models, both empirical as well as physics-based, for modeling climate change hazards and for propagating the deep uncertainties that inevitably exist in any climate change assessment through those models. And finally, to identify feasible engineering solutions for risk mitigation, taking a page from the recently published ASCE monograph, which many of you may be familiar with, adopting infrastructure and civil engineering practice to a changing climate. And finally, in the area of decision support, algorithms for risk-informed decision-making, I provided in the first section of the webinar this morning a very, very simple illustration of a decision support tool in the context of the Centerville testbed. During year 2, we'll move ahead with more sophisticated decision support algorithms, and we'll establish the resolutions of community modeling that are required to support resilience assessments and different decisions for communities of different sizes and contexts. There is a significant issue of scalability and resolution here that needs to be addressed as part of this community resilience assessment if we hope to be able to achieve our resilience goals and to understand the uncertainties in our models. Working with our social and economic science teams, we'll expand our list of performance metrics and hope to initiate a case study that will consider some of the further issues that Professor Peacock talked about in his presentation this morning. What the impact, for example, of pre-disaster and post-disaster planning might have on certain vulnerable populations within a community. Which will also undoubtedly will involve numerous competing objectives as part of the decision support process. One of the new features that we hope to introduce in this assessment procedure will be the introduction of intelligence into the decision support algorithm. That is to say, some sort of an internally generated check on the quality of the models and the quality of the supporting databases that would provide guidance to a decision maker as to the level of confidence that he or she could place in the results of the resilience assessment and whether or not it might be necessary to invest in additional information before the resilience assessments actually have any practical meaning for decision purposes. So I think that that's going to be a challenge for us to do that, but I think it's going to be one of the things that distinguishes NIST from any other platform, that incorporation of intelligence into the decision support process. This slide shows you how you might learn more about the center, either through communication with us or through our website. I encourage you to send us your inquiries and to ask us questions. We are very interested in your comments. We certainly do appreciate your interest in our research enterprise that we've summarized this morning, and hope that you will feel free to contact us for additional information. That closes my prepared remarks. Professor Mahmood has been dutifully monitoring the comments that have come in by chat during this morning's presentation. We've addressed a few of these, but in the following 30 minutes or so, we will attempt to answer as many of them as we possibly can. And so thinking in terms of the very large community outside listening to us, the floor is open for your questions and for your comments. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Just to bring up the speakers that we'll have questions for, we'll have questions for myself, Bruce, Walt, Harvey, Dorothy, and Dan. So if you could come up and just stand near the podium for me, that would be great. And Dr. Mahmoud Hussam, if you can ask the questions directly, please.
Okay, so we'll start with a question for Dan. For the tsunami analysis, I was wondering if losses are based on nonlinear dynamic analysis of each building or on fragility curves developed as a function of the intensity measure.
So it's the second part. So we're using existing fragility curves. These are empirical curves that were developed after the Tohoku event. As a starting point, our group is also working on physics-based fragility curves, but right now the loss assessment is all based on the amount of structural damage that we're predicting from these curves. We're not considering any damage to the contents of the buildings or anything like that. Does that answer your question?
So, all right, the second question is for Bruce. The question is, population dislocation was referred to as a short term. Is there any modeling for longer term dislocation?
Thank you for that question, and it allows me to clarify something which I should emphasize. We do have longer-term models for population dislocation that have been developed by the social sciences team. The focus of our analysis during the first year of the project was primarily on pre-disaster planning and prompt effects. We have only begun recently to initiate work in community recovery, and as we move in the coming year toward an emphasis on developing recovery models, those effects, including long-term versus short-term population, certainly will be incorporated in the algorithm. We simply have not gotten to that point with our research yet.
Okay. Next question is for Walt. On social resilience is a manifestation of strength. What social strengths are being included in the modeling?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think part of the confusion can be if we're focusing on social vulnerability, thinking that social vulnerability is the exact opposite of resiliency, when in fact it's not. I mean, we're really exploring various dimensions. And when we're looking at these different social characteristics, oftentimes there are one extreme and the other, i.e. less assets, less information, less capacity versus more as well too. And we actually see that as Bruce talked about in terms of the dislocation models, that traditionally dislocation models only focus on the physical damage to the structure, whereas there are both opportunistic components of dislocation as well as suppression components in dislocation. And so part of what's happening when we're including in our social dimensions there is we're actually capturing increased dislocation, or at least temporary dislocation, by high asset households that have insurance and everything and are capable of moving out of those situations, versus oftentimes a suppression even under situations of high damage, especially to owner-occupied lower-income households. They're forced to stay in the household because they don't have that. So part of with resilience, what we're trying to capture is both the capacities to address and mobilize resources, as well as not being able to, or less resources to mobilize. I think some of the other features that we're trying to capture in there too are civic capacity as well too. So capturing the capacities of neighborhoods. So even if we are talking about a low income neighborhood, there are still capacities in there, the social networks and social capital that can be mobilized to kind of address those issues. So we're trying to kind of develop some measures that will enable us to capture that as well too. Much more difficult with secondary data, oftentimes demanding that we look at other more creative data sources to actually try to capture those dimensions. But you're absolutely right. We need to be thinking about both components of those issues of resilience.
So the next question is for Harvey. It's on regarding transfer payments. What about Social Security, welfare, etc.? Where are these captured? Where are these captured economically? And there can be a strong transportation dependence on these. So is that being included?
Thank you. The data set, I didn't talk much about this, but the data set we're collecting to build a social accounting matrix, which is the foundation of the CG model. One of the sources is the PUMS data set, which I think Walt alluded to before. And in that data set, they actually have, they survey people, and in there you have data on actually Social Security payments that are going to households. So we actually have got a pretty good estimate of that we actually put into the CG model. We also have household remittances, resources that are coming in from outside the economy that help fund household expenditures. So in the model, typically it's the case that welfare payments per capita are much larger for the lower income earning households. So we actually can model that as well. And so this will be a factor actually in the recovery, because you'd expect Social Security payments and welfare payments to be, at least not to have it be negatively impacted if there's a natural hazard. The last part of the question is actually interesting, and I'm actually struggling with that answer. And he's asking about transportation effects. I'm not exactly sure how to address this, but since we have spatial components in the CG model, off the top of my head, though, I can't see locations of households. And maybe actually if transportation, if a road has been damaged, I'm just not sure that the welfare payments or Social Security payments would be impacted. I guess if the electronic system was down, which would be pretty severe, then maybe resources could not be allocated on in a timely way. But if any of my other econ people have any ideas about that, feel free to jump in. But we can model welfare and Social Security payments pretty directly. So thank you.
Thank you. Next question is for Dorothy. The interdependency work seems to be, looking at the community in isolation. Is this correct? And in reality, most of the infrastructure services are provided on a regional basis.
Thank you. You make an excellent point, and we've discussed this at length, the spatial resolution. What is a community? Actually, what infrastructure services are available, what are required. We've tried to look at this in different ways. One is the fragility. So is the generation source for our area far outside? How is it affected by the hazard? So sort of as a response variable, we looked at that. We've also looked at incorporating different spatial units for the community itself. I think also one of the other things is the resourcefulness and the rapidity will depend upon whether or not there's assistance from outside the community in the case of, say, power crews coming in from outside to assist. So I believe that's one of the points that you're trying to make here. It's a very important point, and yes, we are looking at it. So any suggestions you have would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the next question is for John. The question is, does the tornado analysis couple with a rain or hail damage analysis similar to the tsunami and earthquake model in terms of looking at multi-hazard?
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent question. At this stage, we do have a rainfall or effectively a water intrusion model. We've not incorporated it yet. We've not considered hail at this point, although I do realize, and I think the Senate has realized, the extent of damage that occurs in hailstorms, particularly with us headquartered here in Colorado. At this point, we're looking at really two things to improve the tornado model. So it's a wind field model right now, but we're focusing year 2 on inclusion of the pressure deficit, so the distance of the buildings or the building as a function of the tornado path, how far it is from the center, and what that pressure deficit is as it drops off exponentially as you go away perpendicular from the tornado path. So that's one major thing, and then the debris analysis. That is the missile impacts, things like that, and that's an extremely complex topic. Certainly, right now we're considering more of a statistical approach than a physics-based approach with that. So we'd have, I guess what you'd say, a quasi-physics-based approach for debris hazard and combined with that. So it would be a multi-hazard, but we consider it all coupled within the tornado analysis. So I guess the short answer is we are working on some of those, but not all. Thank you.
The next question is for Walt. Question is, do the models consider risk and viability and rebuilding versus relocating areas of a jurisdiction or the jurisdiction itself? These tough questions involve social, economical, and political components.
Yes, extremely tough questions. It's being a disaster researcher. It's great to go in right after an event, right? I mean, everybody kind of knows what we need to deal with, but then afterward, I mean, when we're talking about land use, when we're talking about long-term recovery, when we're talking about mitigation, when we're talking about broad-based policies, programs, and events that address who has what, where they can develop, how we are distributing resources, extraordinarily tough questions. And I think Bruce gave a sense of that in terms of how we are attempting to address that in terms of our decision support systems. There are not going to be any clear answers. Fundamentally, what we need is ways or approaches for enabling us to evaluate what are the potential consequences and to incorporate. These have to be community-based decisions. And indeed, I think that is one of the long-term goals of this process. Actually, Terri addressed that in her talk, that it's not just the science for us to play around with the modeling, but it's to get it out there as well into the community, to get it part of the planning process. And indeed, we're seeing more and more emphasis, both at the federal level and I hope increasingly at the state level, of considering long-term recovery planning prior to an event, because it's way too late in many respects, and we're forced to kind of deal with very difficult situations after an event. But when we're dealing with it beforehand, and we can address issues of mitigation, we can address issues of land use policies, we can address issues of where it is we develop, how it is we develop, how we have adjust our building codes, that's going to be the beauty, I hope, of what we're trying to do, because the community can be included, and not just one or two decision makers. If we're not including the community, then we're going to fail as a nation in terms of understanding how it is we can address resiliency issues in the long run. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I hope it came close.
Well, don't go too far. Thanks, Walt, for answering the tough question. We will attempt to cover with an easier question. So the question is, will this social vulnerability analysis build on a comparative understanding of which social factors have a stronger effect on recovery? For example, does income drive resilience far more than race? In other words, are we doing a sensitivity analysis to evaluate what's important?
I love that question as well. So I've got goosebumps on that question. So, no, seriously, I mean, there are a variety of approaches that we're taking here. One is to drive our algorithms based upon existing research and current research that we're engaged in. So one of the things that we're trying to do in terms of our vulnerability modeling is really focus on individual dimensions of that to actually assess that. And you can, again, see it in the dislocation models. We are including income and race ethnicity because those are at least the factors in terms of the empirical research we're using are driving those issues and why we're seeing very different results than standard approaches to addressing that. So yes, in our research we are evaluating that, and not only we are evaluating it, but we're incorporating it into the algorithms, and we will be explicit in terms of that and what are the consequences. One of the wonderful things about Centerville is allowing us to do some of that sensitivity analysis and stuff. And we, the last few weeks have been really fun, kind of playing with those issues and really understanding what are the consequences of the nature of how it is that those models are put together and the relative weightings of, for example, income versus race ethnicity versus other household characteristics. So yes, we are doing that, and we hope to continue to do that as long as we are in a richer data environment.
All right, the next question is for Bruce. The question is regarding the Centerville example. Has the expected damage caused by earthquakes, tornado, and so on buildings and infrastructure been determined using the HAZUS method?
We haven't done that yet. It's not quite so easy a exercise as you might think. Because one of the features, of course, of our analysis is its ability to propagate uncertainties throughout the decision platform. HAZUS is what I would characterize as a mean value aggregator, and that's not a criticism. It just says effectively that you cannot calculate the uncertainties associated with response using HAZUS without rerunning the program a very, very, very large number of times. We haven't chosen to do that as of yet in our studies because we've been focusing on developing our own algorithms and our own methods of attack that may differ somewhat from what HAZUS already does. I suspect that someplace along the line we probably will do something like that just as part of our tutorials that we're going to develop in a later time so that people will have some perspective as to what advantages our platform offers over some of the competing platforms. It's not a trivial task. It's a little bit like statistical design of experiments. You cannot run HAZUS once and run our analysis once and just compare the 2 points estimates that way. You have to consider the uncertainties in the process as well to come up with a meaningful comparison between the two. And we haven't addressed that issue yet.
We have another question, and this will be the last question, and then John will follow up with the remarks before the conclusion of the webinar. So the last question is again for Bruce. The question is to determine trade-offs between the 3 mitigation policies in the Centerville example are using current codes or assessing potential new codes based on current and future conditions.
The answer is a qualified yes. Remember now that Centerville, as we constructed that community, consists of a building inventory that was designed and constructed over a period of approximately 60 years, beginning right at the end of the Second World War. And so Centerville, as it currently stands, actually consists of buildings that were designed by approximately 4 or 5 different generations of building code, depending on how frequently the building codes are revised. And so in our exercise, we did not consider specifically what would be the impact if we enhanced the building performance from the 1973 code to the 1986 code, for example, because that sort of a comparison was really not meaningful. What we did instead was that we imagined that the inventory would be retrofit to different code levels depending on the strategy that was selected for enhancing or optimizing the community resilience, given the competing objectives that we had. So we imagined, for example, that a certain percentage of building in each zone would be upgraded from, for example, low code to high code, or low code to moderate code. If one were to want to consider a specific code as a basis for upgrading, why, it would be very easy, to put that into the decision algorithm. We would just have to modify that element within NIST core to allow a specific building code or a specific set of building practices to be reflected. But we didn't do that yet. We haven't looked at that, at least not at this stage of the research. Thank you very much. I'd like to have John, my co-director, come up, and he has just a few words to say in closing the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for some interesting and insightful questions and responses as well. So on behalf of the entire Center of Excellence, my co-director, Bruce Ellingwood, that you just heard from, as well as everyone that's in the live audience, I'd like to thank you for your participation in today's webinar. Just a couple of closing comments that there'll be the YouTube link will be posted on the Center of Excellence webpage, and it will take you to the Denver Media website YouTube channel, and that'll be available for a number of years, is my understanding, and that includes the entire webinar from today. And also, we realized we weren't able to get to all the questions, so written responses will be posted on the Center webpage. And we'll also email those in a PDF to those that were registered for the webinar. Feel free to circulate those amongst yourselves as well. And so again, thank you very much. And this concludes today's webinar, Supporting Community Resilience. Thank you.